In this video, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite drawing materials, red chalk, also known as Sanguine. I'm going to briefly cover the history of this drawing material, the reason for its popularity, and then I'll show you genuine red chalk, which is very rarely used today, as well as these red chalk pencils that are now used in its place. Then I'll do a drawing demo with some tricks and tips for using this wonderful stuff. Red chalk is a form of red hematite, a rock composed of ferric oxide that is one of the oldest drawing materials being used in Paleolithic art, such as the cave paintings of Altamira. Its use as a drawing material in the modern period begins in the mid-15th century, concurrent with developments in the manufacturing of paper. Prior to the widespread use of paper in Europe, the primary drawing surface was parchment, which is calfskin that had to be carefully smoothed and prepared for drawing. This was an expensive material, so the drawings on it tended to be very carefully finished and small, done either in metal point or pen and ink. The development of paper made drawing much less expensive, allowing artists to experiment with looser, faster techniques better suited for more expressive ways of drawing. Besides being abundant and cheap, red chalk had a number of advantages over other drawing materials at the time. It was harder than black chalk, which meant one could draw sharper details. Red chalk also gripped the paper more effectively than black chalk, which meant that it didn't smear as much. It also gripped the paper far better than charcoal, which at the time was not available in the dark compressed form that we have today. Most importantly, it allowed an artist to significantly vary the line quality, thick, thin, light, dark, to achieve soft transitions from light to shadow, and to create delicate halftones. Furthermore, it allowed an artist to liberate themselves from the constriction of less correctable delicate techniques such as metal point. The artist no longer had to be delicate. They could be bold and decisive as well as delicate and conscientious. In short, red chalk allowed for a much larger range of effects, and I believe its use drove many of the artistic developments in Renaissance painting, most importantly the move away from line to value being the primary underpinning of pictorial organization. Then there is its color, which more closely mimicked the warm glow of human flesh, making it a color most suitable for the depiction of the human form. In the early Renaissance, red chalk was called Sinopia and initially used for making underdrawings for fresco. One of the earliest artists to make full use of the possibilities of red chalk as a drawing medium was Leonardo DaVinci. It was brought even more into prominence by Michelangelo, who used it in his many studies for the Sistine Chapel. By the middle of the 16th century, it was one of the most widely used drawing mediums in Italy. Its use made its way north to France by the Italian artist Primaticcio, where it took hold under such artists as Jean Clouet. Artists in France began to use red chalk not only on its own, but in combination with black and white chalks to create what is called the trois crayons technique, the three crayon technique. As you can see in these drawings, red chalk in combination with white and black can be used to create an almost full color effect with subtle and convincing skin tones. This three crayon technique was a precursor of color pastel drawing that came into prominence during the Rococo period. During the 18th century, red chalk continued to be very prominent in France, employed with great delicacy by such artists as Antoine Watteau, Fragonard, and Bucher. Its use was even extended to subjects other than figure drawing, with Fragonard and Hubert Robert producing incredibly beautiful landscapes. But by the end of the 18th century, this material began to be less and less favored. Good quality red chalk was getting harder to find, and an increase in the manufacture of artificial red chalk was the result. This was made by grinding hematite and other pigments into sticks with the use of binders such as gum arabic. The advantage of this new material is that it was consistent in color and hardness, and was considerably cheaper. Despite this development, black drawing materials began to be more popular in the 19th and 20th century. This was due to one man, the French painter and scientist Nicolas Jacques Conté, who, in response to the shortage of graphite due to the Napoleonic Wars, created a new drawing material which combined graphite charcoal with wax-based binders. This new drawing material, now named a Conté stick, had the advantage that it came in a variety of different hardnesses. By the 20th century, black drawing materials, Conté sticks, along with the graphite pencil, which by the way Conté is also responsible for, and compressed charcoal, replaced red chalk entirely. And it was only the resurgence of interest in historical drawing materials toward the end of the 20th century that brought it back into use. So here it is. This is naturally occurring hematite. This little piece was bought from Clouet Pigment years ago. And here are a bunch of fake red chalk pencils that I have tried in search of a perfect replacement. The original is still very common. You can still buy it and it's not all that expensive. Why don't I use it then? Well, as I previously mentioned, the good stuff was mined out of existence some 200 years ago, and either no new source has been found, or, more likely, sources do exist, but with a plethora of cheaper, more consistent, and less expensive artificial materials out there, it's probably no longer economically feasible to mine it. The problem with the red chalk that's currently available on the market is that it's full of grit. That means that it stops drying and scrapes your paper with every few strokes. It's also inconsistent in terms of hardness at times, being very, very soft and at other times quite hard. So the question is, if good quality red chalk isn't available, what is the next best thing? This, of course, is highly dependent on the kind of drawing you enjoy doing, but here are a bunch of alternatives that we're going to test and analyze, and then after the test, I'm going to give you my recommendations for what I think is the best alternative to naturally occurring red chalk. I have 11 different red chalk pencils here that were collected over 2 decades in my quest for the perfect red chalk alternative. I should say that I've used each of these pencils extensively in my quest and can speak about them with some experience. The chart is broken up into 5 categories, the first of which is color. As you can see, I have 2 swatches, one when the color is dry, and then something that's unique to many red chalk pencils, wet. Using the material wet gives you a little bit of a darker value, a trick that was often employed by the old masters. There's a range of color that qualify as red chalk, from dark and almost purplish to lighter and almost orange. Real red chalk had a variety of colors as well, with mines all over Europe and the Mediterranean providing a huge variety of colors and tints. The value of the pencil is particularly important if you want to use red chalk over toned paper. If the value of your pencil is too light, it will not provide enough contrast. This is why red chalk was traditionally used over lighter colored papers. Then I have a test for hardness, ranked from 0 to 5, 0 being super soft and 5 being hard. Then a test for oiliness. Red chalk pencils fall into 2 broad categories: chalky pencils that have a similar working property to pastels, and oil-based pencils that are closer to wax-based color pencils. The reality is that red chalk pencils are on a continuum running from chalky to oily, and knowing where the pencil is will help you choose the right pencil for the kind of drawing style you favor. Oilier pencils are less susceptible to smudging, which means that they're better for retaining a sharpness of line, for cross-hatching, and fine detail. The disadvantage being, of course, is that they don't lend themselves to soft blending techniques. They also tend not to erase very well. Chalkier pencils tend to be softer and scratchier. They tend to be better for blending, but most of them, because of their softness, are not as good for hatching or fine detail. Then we have a test for erasability. Real red chalk is not particularly good for erasing, and neither are its substitutes. Also, this is highly dependent on the type of paper used, the kind of eraser, the amount of material you put down, but just to give you a general idea of the erasability of the materials, I thought this might be useful. Last category is smudgeability or smearability, a good, bad, or neutral thing depending on how you draw. For me, sometimes being able to blend red chalk, let's say with other chalks, is advantageous, or the occasional use of the stump to create soft transitions. I'm also a fan of cross-contour hatching, a technique that favors materials that stay put and do not smudge. So depending on the technique, one pencil might be better than another. In the last category are my personal rankings of these pencils. Notice that I didn't rate the red chalk since it's not a material I commonly draw with, but I will give it a ranking towards the end and tell you which one of these pencils is closest to the original. Let's start off with my least favorite, these bottom 2. This one's made by Lyra. This is the Rembrandt Polycolor series, Indian Red. And this one is made by Faber-Castell, the Polychromos series, and the color is Sanguine. As I see it, these really don't qualify as red chalk, simply being color pencil with a similar color. Though the color is very nice, these pencils are very waxy, making them difficult to layer and go very dark. As a result, you get a very light drawing. They're also very poor erasers. These are not bad for small drawings because of their hardness and for hatching, but ultimately I'd rather use other pencils for the purpose. These two are ranked 7 and 8 respectively. This is a pastel pencil made by Derwent, their terracotta color, and this one is made by Cretacolor. This is their dry Sanguine. So Cretacolor makes 2 varieties of Sanguine. They have a dry Sanguine and they have an oil-based Sanguine, which we'll talk about later. Both these have very nice colors, but the pigment grind in them is very coarse, which doesn't allow it to stick to the paper particularly well. I find that when I draw with these two, a lot of the pigment actually runs down the paper. Also, both these are very soft, which makes you have to sharpen them constantly when drawing. Also, to me, they're slightly unpleasant to draw with, giving you that kind of fingernails on chalkboard feel. Number 6, this one, made by Faber-Castell, their Pitt oil base, I drew with for quite a long time. It's on the waxy side of the continuum, but not nearly as waxy as these bottom 2. Its hardness allows you to work very small, and the fact that it doesn't smear allows for hatching. This pencil is very good if you want to work small and light. It is a problem, however, if you want to work darker. Look, I really wish that the value was darker, then this pencil would be almost perfect for most things. But alas, it's one of the lighter valued pencils here, which makes it very pale for most drawing, and furthermore, it's completely useless on toned paper. Number 5, made by Carbothello and marked by only a number, is more on the chalky side, but considerably smoother than these bottom two, the Derwent or the Cretacolor Dry Sanguine. I also really like the much darker value, making it absolutely great for toned paper, or just a drawing where you need stronger contrast. The problem is, it's just a little bit too soft for my taste, which is too bad, because if it was just a touch harder, it would rank considerably higher. Number 4 is a pencil that I really like. This one is made by Cretacolor, but is their oil sanguine as opposed to their dry chalky sanguine. It falls more or less in the middle of the chalky waxy continuum, though perhaps a little more on the oily side as opposed to the chalky side. It could be a touch harder, but I think the main issue is the color, which is just a little bit too light for my taste, making it unsuitable for toned paperwork. Great pencil overall, and actually recommended. Again, one that I've used for many, many years. Number 3 is a little bit chalkier than the Cretacolor oil-based. It's made by Prismacolor, which is a surprising brand because it's usually known for their wax-based color pencils. This pencil, despite being a little bit chalkier, is really smooth and dense, if only it was a little bit darker. Number 2 is the Sanguine pencil made by Conte. This is very close to the middle of the chalky waxy continuum, but perhaps a touch more on the chalky side, a bit chalkier than the Prismacolor. Unlike other chalk-based pencils, it's very, very smooth, clearly utilizing a finer, denser coloring agent. As you can see, it also smudges fairly well, but also retains a sharpness of line, making it good both for blended work and for hatching. My favorite pencil of all time, however, and the pencil that strangely I encountered almost at the beginning of my red chalk journey, is this one, the Gioconda, made by the Czech company Jean-Honore. This is an oil-based pencil that for me provides just the right balance of chalkiness and oiliness. It also has just the right hardness, allowing you to work small and to hatch, as well as to work more expressively. It doesn't blend particularly well, but if I want to do a drawing of more blending work, I'll use the Conte pencil for that purpose. I first discovered this pencil in the late 90s, fell in love with it, and then it disappeared from the shelves. This is a lesson for you all. Never fall in love with an art supply, because Murphy's Law dictates that it will disappear from the shelves immediately. After I couldn't find it anymore, I began my hunt for an alternative, which led me to try just about all of these. Then, about a decade ago, Utrecht, a now defunct art supply store, started carrying these pencils, which were surprisingly similar to the ones I fell in love with. Then, sometimes after, Jean-Honore reappeared on the shelves, and it turned out that these two pencils were in reality identical. Now, where does the red chalk rank? Well, that's difficult to say. It's very different than the pencils here. For one thing, it's much softer, and while it's clearly on the chalky side, it's also much smoother and more buttery than other chalk pencils, making it feel almost oily, like a very high-quality pastel. It's clear that the pigment in this is much finer and much denser than in these pencils. When not hitting grit, it absolutely glides across the paper like nothing else, and look at how it smears. It's also much stickier than the other chalk-based pencils. I can only imagine what a joy it would have been to draw with a high-quality red chalk, but unfortunately with this one, the constant grit and inconsistency of hardness is impossible to overcome. It's also very soft and will be really difficult to sharpen to a sharp point. I imagine that back in the day, you could easily find pieces of red chalk that were harder without all the irritating grit. The closest pencil to it? Well, probably the Derwent Pastel, but this Derwent Pastel is not nearly as dense or as smooth. So where would I rank it? Well, as it is now, it's barely usable, so close to the bottom. If it weren't for the grit and inconsistency, and if it was a touch harder, it could easily win first place. Okay, now that we've looked over this chart and chosen some winners, let me do a quick red chalk figure drawing for you with my favorite pencil, this Jean-Honore Gioconda, and I'll show you the basics of using this material as well as a few tricks. One of the things you may have noticed in the red chalk drawings that I showed you is that most of them were done on lightly toned paper that had either a slight reddish or yellowish color to it. You obviously don't have to do this, but you can achieve a similar effect by taking a soft pastel, such as the new pastel brand, in a similar color to your red chalk, and lightly rubbing it on your paper, and then you can take a paper towel and smear it down until you get a very soft color. This slight tone will give your drawing a very beautiful warm glow, and obviously a slightly antique look, but you can potentially limit the contrast in your drawing, so do not make it too dark. The Kohinoor red chalk is not a particularly good eraser, so one recommendation is to do your initial sketch using a Conte pencil, which is chalky and erases much better. The Conte is pretty soft, however, so work lightly to build your drawing, and then once you're confident that your underdrawing is correct, you can switch to your oil-based Kohinoor pencil. If you'd like to see a breakdown of my figure drawing process, I have quite a few detailed videos in my channel, but to summarize, I usually break down the drawing into a few simple steps. The first step is the construction of a simplified skeleton, then a bulking out stage where I draw simplified volumes to represent the midsection, the neck, and the limbs. This allows me to analyze what the forms are doing in space. After that, I go into the line work and the rendering. Here's another recommendation. Sharpen a bunch of these beforehand. These red chalk pencils are on the harder side of the red chalk continuum, but are still relatively soft and lose their point quickly. Instead of constantly sharpening as I draw, which wastes time, I prefer to have a bunch of these sharpened beforehand. And then, since I have all these pencils down to stumps, I use pencil extenders to maintain the length of the pencil, which allows me to use up the entire pencil and saves me a lot of money. After putting in a few construction lines in the face, I'm ready to go into the line. One of the great things about using a soft material such as red chalk is a tremendous variety of lines you can create. I strongly recommend you vary your lines, thick, thin, light, dark. Not only will a variety of lines serve to emphasize anatomical structures to make your drawing more convincing, a variety of line will also give your drawing energy and a sense of spontaneity. I try to differentiate different surfaces with line, for example, placing sharper, darker lines where I'm seeing bony structures, and softer lines, lighter lines where the forms are rounder and softer. If you'd like to learn more about how line is used in figure drawing, I'll leave a link to a tutorial below. In my opinion, red chalk, unlike charcoal and black chalk, is a medium that is at its most effective when used along with cross-hatching. I think having experience using pen and ink is very helpful for this kind of drawing, and it's no surprise that the greatest master of red chalk drawing, Michelangelo, was also incredibly proficient in drawing with the pen. One drawback to red chalk is, of course, its lack of contrast. There are ways of adding additional contrast to your drawing, however. One way is to wet the tip of your pencil, which will give you a slightly darker value. This is something that I did in the nostrils, the eyes, and a little bit in the hair. The other thing you can do is to use an eraser to pop out the highlights if you're working on tone paper, of course. For this purpose, you can use either a kneaded eraser or a hard eraser. You can also use a little bit of white chalk to add highlights. Also, keep in mind that a little bit of black in your red chalk drawing, like I'm doing now, is a perfectly acceptable practice. In this case, I'm using a Pitt oil-based pencil, which is very similar in hardness and oiliness to the Kohinoor red chalk pencil I was using before. I hope you enjoyed this video on red chalk. This has been one of my favorite mediums to draw with from the very beginning of my journey as an artist, and I hope I inspired you to try it. Perhaps, if I get enough people to start using red chalk pencils, it'll generate enough demand that art material manufacturers will begin looking for new sources of the real stuff. But for now, most of the pencils I showed you are perfectly suitable substitutes which offer a range of color, hardness, and consistency to suit your drawing style. I plan to do more videos like this covering other art materials in the near future, so please subscribe and stay tuned. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below and I will do my best to reply.